I've been on a bit of a science fiction binge recently, so I want to talk about three epic, massive scale sci-fi novels that I've been reading. First up is a memory called Empire by Arkady Martine. I've seen so much good press about this book floating around. Heaps of praise have been thrown at this book by great sci-fi writers. It's been nominated for different prizes, and I get it. It's really, really great. This is a book for fans of Star Wars, Game of Thrones, and Dune. In fact, conceptually, tonally, and even in its plotting, it shares a lot of the same DNA as Dune and Game of Thrones. When I first started it, I was so heavily reminded of the first Game of Thrones book that I was calling it in my mind Game of Thrones in Space. This is a book about empire, as the title points out. Much like how the Star Wars prequel trilogy explores how an empire can form from the ashes of democracy, this is a book about how colonialism works, how colonialism spreads, and it looks at the mechanics of it from the inside. Our protagonist is an ambassador called Mahit. She grew up on this system of space stations that don't have their own planet, but they do have their own culture. They're very, very proud of it, and they are adamantly independent. But there is an empire called Kalan. I don't know if that's actually how you pronounce it. It's big sci-fi words. But the Kalani Empire spreads across about a quarter of the galaxy. And they have a delightful tendency of sucking up different planets and cultures, annexing them. And Mahit's colony refuses to be annexed. But there is always an ambassador. One person from this collection of space stations, people who mine local asteroids and moons, who basically lives in the capital amongst the highest ranking parliamentary members of the Kalani Empire as an ambassador, doing ambassadorial things. And Mahit's predecessor died, and so she is sent there to be his replacement. But he was definitely killed. Absolutely definitely, he was killed. And so this is a mystery book, because we wonder who killed him, how, and why. But it's also a book about the cogs of war, the internal machinations of empires and government. Mahit is an outsider who is about as inside as you can get. This is a book about subterfuge, about bartering, about people getting what they want or what they think they need. And there is one thing that Mahit and her people have that the Kalani Empire wants, and it's a specific technology that she is secretly using every moment of every day. They have created this chip that sits at the base of your skull, right at the top of your spine. And that chip is full of data, the memories of a previous person whose job or life is in some way useful to you. And Mahit's chip has the memories and personality of her predecessor. However, her predecessor lived and worked as their ambassador for a long, long time, and this chip is years and years, I think 15 years, out of date. And so there is basically a secondary personality in her head, a ghost or an artificial intelligence version of her predecessor. But the one in her head is much, much younger and more inexperienced and is made up of memories and experiences. It's a kind of younger, fake version of the guy who died. And this is a fascinating piece of technology that her people utilize in really interesting ways in order to maintain their culture and maintain knowledge of the things that they've created and mastered. It's brilliant, but it's valuable, and the Kalani Empire wants it. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, and the reason I compare it to Game of Thrones is if you've read the first book or watched the first season, then she's basically Ned Stark, a guy who takes a political role from a predecessor who was secretly killed, and while in that role is trying to figure out how his predecessor died and why. Who killed him and what did they want and what secrets did he know, what did he uncover, blah blah blah. That's most of the first season of Game of Thrones, and that's a lot of this. So it's Game of Thrones in space, and it's really good. Ancillary Justice by Leckie is a very similar thing in the sense that it is once again a book about empire and colonialism. But I'm irritated at myself that I didn't read this book until now, and I'm irritated at any sci-fi fan who also hasn't read this. This novel is nearly a decade old, and to this day, it is the only novel to win the Hugo, the Nebula, the Locus, and the Arthur C. Clarke Award. All the great awards of fantasy and science fiction were all handed to this novel. That is insane. And it's the same reason why I get irritated by fantasy fans who haven't read N.K. Jemisin, whose Broken Earth trilogy won the Hugo, I think, year after year after year, which again is the only trilogy to do that. But too often fantasy fans haven't read N.K. Jemisin, and sci-fi fans haven't read Ancillary Justice. While A Memory Called Empire is more about political drama, this one is as well, but it has a lot of hard sci-fi concepts. Our protagonist is now one person, called Breck, but they used to be an army. Breck was once an artificial intelligence that took control of a starship and the entire army of soldiers that were stationed on it. One AI controlling a ship and its army. That's a wild idea. But Breck is now confined within one single body. Now this ship that Breck once was called the Justice of Torren, and it and its army were used by the empire of this story to annex various planets and absorb their cultures into the empire and make it grow. This empire is called Radch, which again is something hard to say. R-A-D-C-H, I'm not really sure how to actually pronounce that. But the Radchai Empire controls most of the galaxy, and they just go around annexing planets and getting bigger. But what they used to do, and they currently are not allowed to do anymore, was take a fraction of the population and turn their bodies into mindless, empty husks, zombie-like things that would then be controlled by the AI of a Justice starship, and therefore recruited into the army of that ship, making it bigger. Each of these soldiers that are all controlled by the same AI are called ancillaries. Ancillary Justice. And for thousands of years, that was what Breck did as the Justice of Torren. But now, Breck is one single person on an icy planet outside of the Radch Empire's borders. And they are searching for someone and something. They have a vendetta. They have a mission that they have taken on. And we find this out pretty early on in the book. Their mission is to try and kill the leader of the Empire himself. A man who also has multiple bodies, stretching himself across different clones and interpretations of himself. And Breck wants to find a way to kill him, because he's the reason that Breck is now in this position of only having one body. Something really weird happened. And so we move back and forth between 20 years ago when Breck's life fell apart and this present day moment where they're suddenly on an ice planet searching for something and building their plot of revenge. This is a sci-fi novel that is very, very heavily about imperialism and colonialism. It doesn't shy away from the horrors of those things. Everything that this empire does is just a series of war crimes, absolute atrocities. And it's fascinating to see that all play out from the inside, from the perspective of a fairly wooden and obviously robotic AI, who is now 20 years on from that moment, very different and more sympathetic. It's brilliant. The scope of this book is enormous in terms of its sci-fi concepts, in terms of the way that it explores colonialism and empire, but it's also a very human novel that focuses on one person from multiple different angles, flitting back and forth between the past and the present. And I will say, you might feel really, really lost at the beginning. You could spend the first 50, maybe 100 pages not entirely understanding what's going on, because this is some heavy world building, heavy exposition, but it's all handled really, really well, and you will cope with it. And you'll be intrigued. God, oh, you'll be intrigued. And then we have Do You Dream of Terra-Two by Temi O. This is a very, very different beast. The previous two books had quite a lot in common because they're about imperialism. This is very different. This is basically a coming-of-age story, a teenage drama set on a claustrophobic spaceship. And it's a really winning formula. This book isn't perfect, but the blend of science fiction and coming-of-age story works really, really well. It's certainly not what I expected going in. I expected it to be more heavy on the sci-fi, but I really appreciate the way that people can use the genres of science fiction, fantasy, horror to tell more human stories, to explore aspects that are usually reserved for commercial and literary fiction. In fantasy, you can look at Travis Baldry's Legends and Lattes. In horror, you can look at the books of Grady Hendrix. How to Sell a Haunted House is a brilliant family drama. And in science fiction, you've got this. This is set in an alternate 2012, where the UK has its own space people. NASA. It has its own NASA thing. Space agency? That doesn't seem like the right word. Space people. The world is taking climate change very, very seriously, but luckily we have found a planet that is almost exactly like Earth. It's within our galaxy, but our galaxy's fucking big. And getting to that planet, which is populated by trees and rivers and animals and everything except a more intelligent, self-aware human-like species. Getting there will take 23 years, and it will be obviously a one-way trip. The ship that will get there is a British vessel, which immediately seems very unrealistic, and it's crewed by 10 people. 4 very, very experienced, older, middle-aged people who are astronauts, engineers, and doctors. And 6 teenagers who have spent their lives dreaming of and training for this mission on the Damocles on its one-way mission to Terra-Two, so that we can hopefully start colonizing and terraforming this planet and turning it into a fresh start. Although I guess terraforming isn't the right thing to say because it's already perfect for us. That's why we're going there. It's the perfect planet. So it's just going to be a new start for humanity. But this entire novel is, as I said, a coming-of-age story about the people getting there. For the first quarter, we don't even leave Earth. Exactly 1/4 of this book is dedicated to preparing for this mission and us getting to know our protagonists, our group of 6 teenagers. There is a lot of drama that goes on in this quarter, and in fact, I'm going to spoil something that happens around 100 pages into this 500-page book, because it's fascinating. The very first chapter is told from the perspective of a boy called Jesse, whose dream has been to go on this mission, and he is one of a massive group of teenagers who are all training for this and hoping to be selected for it. The numbers whittle down, and eventually you have 6, and he doesn't make the cut. He's in the reserve group. He's been benched. That's a sports thing, I think. And so for the first chapter, from his perspective, we're just learning about what's going on. This space agency, the existence of Terra-Two, the plan to visit it on a ship. We learn it all from his perspective, but then he doesn't make the cut. And I thought, oh, that's kind of clever. But then, the day before they're about to leave, these teenagers go out into central London, hang out, and one of them dies. She jumps into the Thames, and everyone assumes it must have been a suicide, which is just incredibly shocking. Another one of the kids has already expressed concern about going. She's not sure she wants to, and then she is convinced by one of the others that, no, this is what you want. And then suddenly, a different girl kills herself by jumping into the Thames. And so Jessie is selected to replace her. But the drama that this creates is insane, because one of the other kids on this mission, a boy, was that girl's boyfriend. They'd known each other a long, long time. He's obviously heartbroken, but he still gets on the ship the next day. And Jessie is kind of shunned as her replacement because he wasn't the one that was supposed to go. And they can't help but feel distant from him and almost distrustful of him. If you like coming-of-age stories, if you like teenage dramas, you'll really enjoy this. And the fact that that teenage drama is set in a claustrophobic environment on a ship that is going to be hurtling through space for 23 years, that's insane. In terms of angsty teenage coming-of-age drama, it's kind of like the Atlas 6, but good and sci-fi instead of bad fantasy. I really, really enjoyed this. It is not what I expected at all. But I do like coming-of-age stories when they're not too cringe and they're written with some heft and consideration. And that's exactly what I got here. Do You Dream of Terra-Two is a pretty unique sci-fi book. A coming-of-age story dressed up in science fiction, and I think things like this are breathing a bit of fresh air into the genre, blending genres in a really fun way, and I appreciate it for that. So there you go. Here are 3 great sci-fi books for you to check out if you haven't already. If I had to pick one of the 3, I think the most important one is Ancillary Justice. It's incredibly smart, it's incredibly important, it won 1,000 awards, and rightly so. But all 3 of them are worth your time. Check out whichever one appeals to you the most, and subscribe for books.